I'm JC at Motorcycle Superstore, and welcome to our motorcycle tire guide. Now, I'm going to keep this as a very high-level overview. Lots of types of tires out there, lots of applications, so this is a beginning point for you to start building your tire knowledge. Some of the things we're going to cover in today's video include construction of the tires, tire pressure, sizing and sidewall information, and also some general tire types you'll find for street and off-road use. Now, considering there's so much to look into, feel free to click on any of these links and skip directly to the segments that you're most interested. But there's a lot to cover, so let's get started right now. When we talk about tire construction, it's very similar from street to dirt. You're focused on three main things: your tread, your sidewall, and your carcass. We'll start with the tread because that's what we see first when we look at our motorcycle tires. Now, a couple different things go into your tread. First off, the rubber compound. It can be soft or hard rubber. That's going to affect how it grips the road. It's also going to affect how it works in different soil conditions for off-road use as well. Now, the other thing, the thing that we probably notice most, is the actual tread design. So with the dirt bike tires, big blocks, they're spaced out differently. That is all going to affect the way that it performs in acceleration, braking, and side-to-side transitions. Same thing goes for street bike tires. The tread design is going to affect how it works in different riding conditions. So wet weather tires with more grooves, less grooves for dry conditions. We'll go into that a little bit more later, but pay attention to it because it will affect how your bike handles and how it feels when you're riding down the road. The sidewall of the tire is very simple. Basically, it's this area right here on the side, and it's important because it does several things. First off, it's one area where the manufacturer puts all the tire information. But on top of that, in terms of construction, this is where you get a lot of the stiffness for your tire. This is going to control how it feels on the motorcycle, how it's relaying that information to the rider. Same thing goes for dirt bike tires. Now, it's especially important for off-road because these sidewalls get hammered by rocks and things that could damage them. So, very burly here. This is one of those areas that helps tailor the way that this tire performs as well. We can't talk about the sidewall for too long before we start talking about the full carcass. Now, the carcass is essentially the skeletal structure. So, everything starts from the bead of the tire. The beads are these bundles of wire that are around the very inside. This is what seats against your rim. This is where the tires begin their life. So essentially you have these materials that are then laid over in layers to build this thing up. That's the carcass. So now what you're going to hear when you're talking about tires with your buddies most often is probably radial versus bias. This has everything to do with the way that these plies are laid across. A radial tire has plies that run 90 degrees from the bead straight across the tire. Directly across, very simple and straightforward. A bias-ply tire is going to have them that run at approximately 45-degree angles. So they overlap. What you get with a bias-ply tire essentially is a much more rigid ride. So for heavier bikes like cruisers that aren't as performance-oriented, that's what you're going to find. Also on dirt bike tires because they need that rigidity to handle rocks and roots and whatnot. But for sport bike tires, probably the vast majority of a lot of sport bike and street bike tires, radial is where it's at. So the radial tires flex a little bit more. They give you more grip, they give you more feel. That's going to help out for that type of an application. So you can see as these things are laid across, there's different types of plies. You can have steel belts, you can have Kevlar, you can have rubber plies that lay across obviously. So you can see them here a little bit, and that's going to give you some of the structure and the rigidity that builds up your tire. It also affects what type of tire it is regarding to needing a tube or not needing a tube in order to retain air. So radial tires typically do not need a tube. Bias plies can go either or. Same thing with off-road tires because they're mostly biased. So let's talk a little bit more about the tire pressure now because that's essentially what's really going to make your tire last. It doesn't matter if you have the best or the worst tire for your bike. If you don't have the proper tire pressure in there, the air pressure inside, it's not going to work out for you. So you need to be monitoring that full time. This isn't one of those things you set it and leave it. So tire pressure is important to monitor on a regular basis, but on top of that, you also have to consider what type of tire you're dealing with. You heard us talk about radials and bias. So typically radial tires, those are going to be tubeless tires. Bias tires, they can go either way. They can either have a tube or not. It's going to be noted on the sidewall of your motorcycle tire. It will say if it's a tube type or a tubeless, often a TT or a TL. Also, on top of that, you'll see the maximum PSI that you should be putting in this tire. You're always going to want to refer to the tire specifications or your motorcycle specifications and make sure that that PSI is within that range. Now, some of the things that come from not having tire pressure correct, you can have overinflation issues, which leads to wearing down the center line. Underinflation, you get cupping. There's all kinds of problems that arise from it, and basically you're going to have less tire life and less safety and performance. The sidewall of a tire has a ton of useful information, but you only need to know several key components in order to make some informed decisions. So let's start off with the sizing. We always want to replace our tires with the same size if possible. Now, the bikes are designed to work that way. Engine and chassis development designed to work with that size tire, so good idea to keep them same. Here's how it works. Sizing is basically displayed in several different formats. The most common is the metric. That's a 3-number system. You might also see it as an alpha. You might also see it as a standard inch designation. However, you'll use conversion charts to work with those. Today we're going to cover the metrics. So on these 2 examples, we have 3 numbers here. This one is a 90, 90, 21. The first number is the width of your tire. The second number is the height of the sidewall. And the third number is the rim diameter. Okay, so in this example, 90, 90, 21. 90 millimeters wide. It's an aspect ratio, so it's not 90 millimeters tall, it's 90% of the width of the tire. That works out to 81 millimeters, so your sidewall is actually 81 millimeters. The third number is 21. That's the rim diameter. This is the front tire, 21-inch rim. Let's look at this example. This is a rear tire. 130/80 R17, 130 millimeters wide. 80% of that tall, which is 104 millimeters, and then R stands for radial, and 17-inch tells us that it's a 17-inch diameter rim. Now, you're going to have to match all those up and make sure they fit on your motorcycle. Now that we have the sizing figured out, let's cover some more important features as well. Following the sizing information, there's a few more numbers that we need to pay attention to. Now, primarily this is the load index and the speed rating. So, on this example here, we have our sizing, then we see MC. That means it's a motorcycle-specific tire. Following that, we see 54R. This is telling us that this has a load index of 54 and a speed rating of R. You need some conversion charts to be able to tell what that means. Now, in this particular example, if you look at the charts, the 54 load index means that this tire can carry up to 467 pounds. The R speed rating means that it's good for up to 106 miles per hour. If you exceed those, you might start experiencing tire failures. Let's look at this example. Here's our sizing, 130/80 R17. MC, it's a motorcycle tire. Now it's a 65H. That means that this tire, a 65 load index, that goes up to 639 pounds. Also, the H rating means it's good for up to 130 miles per hour. So you're going to see this varying from tire to tire. These are adventure touring tires. Sport bike tires have much higher speed indexes, but lower carrying capacity. Cruiser bikes have lots of carrying capacity because you got luggage and passengers and trailers, but they're not designed to go extremely fast, so they have lower speed ratings. What's important is that you always match or exceed what came on your motorcycle originally. If you start dropping below that, the bike was not designed to work with those types of tires. So always meet or exceed those ratings. We've got our sizing and our speed and load figured out. Those are the biggies. Now, some finer details about sidewall information. First off, if it's for street use, it needs to be DOT certified. So look for it to say DOT somewhere on the tire. For off-road tires like this, they'll typically say not for highway use or non-DOT. Also, you're going to look for the date of the tire, the date of manufacture. Now, this is a 4-digit number. On this example here, it says 4613. That means it was made in the 46th week of 2013. The newer the tire, the better. Now, just because they're a little bit old doesn't mean they're necessarily bad. It more has to do with how they were stored. However, fresher tires are always a better idea. Now, one last final thing for you to consider. All that information is great as you're purchasing your tires, but when you go to mount it, you need to make sure you pay attention to which way it needs to rotate. Particularly with street bike tires, this is most important. So they will tell you which way it's supposed to turn as it's going down the road. If you mix those up and flip it around, it will not perform the same and you may have tire failures. Off-road tires can often be flipped around to get more longevity, or in the case of this one, this can be rotated in one direction for performance on hard pack and rotated in another direction for performance on soft terrain. So there are some options, but it's important to pay attention to these things when you're mounting them up. That covers most of the information you need to know on sidewalls. Let's move on to something else. Now let's talk about some different types of tire for street bike applications. I'm going to talk about sport bike, street bike, and cruiser tires all lumped into one because essentially the concepts are the same. Now, you're going to look at a couple different spectrums of performance. First off, do you want it to be a really grippy tire and have ultimate performance, or do you want it to be a long-lasting tire? Now, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. The construction of the tire, the carcass, the sidewall plies, and also the rubber compound. So the softer the rubber compound, the more it's going to grip the road. It's also going to scrub off that rubber faster and wear out quickly. High mileage tires have harder rubber compounds, typically more plies, so it's a stiffer carcass. That's going to let it wear a lot longer, but you're not going to get that pure grip and that adhesion to the road in the corners particularly. Now, something else to consider. Wet weather versus dry performance. So anytime you see lots of grooves in the tire, that's to help push water away from it and allow it to grip in wet weather. Anytime you see very few, like in this example, this is more for dry performance. On a racetrack, it's very clear cut. You're either racing in the rain or it's dry. But for everyday riding, these tires have to work in a broad condition spectrum. So keep that in mind and apply it to where you ride and how you ride. Something else to remember as well, heat affects this. So the more heat you have in your tire, the better it's going to grip regardless of the rubber compound. So try to warm it up before you start pushing the boundaries. Also, tread patterns like this are a very traditional style of cruiser tread. However, with modern tires especially, you can get much more performance-oriented tires and treads that look more like this for your cruiser. So keep that in mind as well. Now, we've covered the basics here. Let's see how it applies to the off-road world. There's lots of different riding conditions off-road, but some common themes in the way that these things are manufactured in terms of tire performance is the type of soil they're designed to work in. So are they going to work in mud and sand, intermediate type terrain where you get hard pack and soft stuff, or is it purely hard pack where it's mostly blue groove and lots of rocks? Now, the difference is primarily for hard pack tires, you're going to see more blocks closely spaced together. For softer terrain tires, you're going to find larger blocks spaced farther apart so that they can self-clean a little bit better. Now, that's how they all kind of blend together, but there are some main differences as well. So, motocross tires essentially run on 19-inch rear rims. A lot of enduro tires primarily are 18-inch rear rims. That's a main difference. Another thing, motocross tires are typically wider and shorter, lower profile. So this is because they're designed to work better on ruts, and they're also designed to absorb jumps and whoops, those types of obstacles. When we go off-road, we're not going to see the jumps and the whoops as much. We're going to find roots and rocks, things like that. So the taller sidewall, partly because it's an 18-inch rim and not 19, is going to help absorb those a little bit different. A stiffer sidewall construction will also help you get back to the truck if you do run into a flat tire scenario. Now, you know how to size them, you know what types to look for, but another thing to remember is that some dirt tires are actually able to be used on the street. So keep in mind, look for that DOT signal, and remember that if it's designed to work on the street or if it's legal to work on the street, it's probably not going to be quite as good as in the dirt as a pure off-road tire. So let's look at some of the dual sport and adventure type tires that blend some of these technologies together. Dual sport and adventure touring tires have the hardest job of any on the market. They actually have to work in street environments and off-road environments. So the number one caveat is that they have to be DOT rated. Don't take your motocross tire and run it down the highway. It's not designed for that. The heat buildup is not good for it. So make sure you're safe and legal by running DOT only for dual sport purposes. Now, the way these generally break down, it's going to be a ratio of how much time you're going to spend in certain environments. So, street versus dirt. A tire like this over here, we'd call this a 90-10. 90% of your time you're on the street, 10% of the time you're in the dirt. You can see it doesn't have big spaces between, it's mostly smooth. This tire in the center, this is more of a 70-30. So 70% of the time it's going to be on pavement, works well there. 30% of the time in the dirt, bigger spaces, you can tell it's a little bit gnarlier. Over here, we'd call this one a 50-50. In reality, it's probably more heavily onto the dirt side. However, that's typically how they're labeled. Now, keep in mind, dirt performing tires like this are really not going to be good on the street. So you have to be honest with yourself on what you need these for. Tires like this aren't nearly as cool looking as this one in the center for your big adventure touring bike, but if you're only going to be riding a lot of street, stick with these kinds of tires and vice versa, because you'll be much happier and much safer down the road. That's the general breakdown. You can go ahead and research lots of different tires. You might see them listed as 85, 15s or whatever, but now that you know essentially how they're laid out, you can go and find the right tire for your machine and your riding type. Well, that about does it for our motorcycle tire guide. Thanks so much for watching. I know it was a lot of information, but if you'd like to see any of those segments again, click on these links right here. You can go to those sections and get the info that you need. Now it's time to find the right tire for your motorcycle. Check out motorcyclesuperstore.com, see customer reviews, detailed product videos, and lots of product descriptions. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.